The sound hit me before I even looked up, that hollow, sickening crunch of metal folding against metal, the kind of sound that stops time completely. I was standing in my own driveway, minding my own business, holding a cup of coffee that was still steaming in the cool morning air. Birds were singing. A lawnmower hummed 2 streets over. It was one of those deceptively peaceful October mornings where the leaves are turning gold, and you almost forget that some people are fundamentally, irredeemably terrible. And then I heard it. That sound. I turned around slowly, the way you do when some part of your brain already knows what it's going to see and is trying to delay the confirmation for just one more second. And there she was. Margaret Hollis, HOA president of Sycamore Ridge for 6 consecutive years, self-appointed queen of a 47-house subdivision in Central Virginia, standing beside a midnight black Mercedes S-Class with her HOA-branded golf cart still rolling gently away from the passenger door like it was trying to flee the scene before she did. There was a dent, a real one, 4 inches wide, punched clean into the door panel, with a paint scrape trailing down toward the wheel well like a white scar. Margaret looked at the dent. She tilted her head slightly, the way someone does when they're calculating rather than feeling. Then she looked left. She looked right. She smoothed the front of her polo shirt, the one with the little Sycamore Ridge HOA crest embroidered on the chest, because of course it had a crest, and she turned and walked back toward her house. No note, no knock on my door, no acknowledgement that anything had happened at all. She just walked away. Now here's the part that Margaret Hollis, in all of her arrogant, petty, entitled glory, could not have known in that moment. The man who owned that Mercedes had spent the last 22 years of his career working for a federal agency that does not take kindly to people who damage government-adjacent property and stroll away whistling. He had personally overseen the prosecution of 11 public corruption cases. He had put away city council members, county commissioners, and at least 2 people with HOA affiliations. And Margaret had just dented his door. She didn't key herself into his calendar. She didn't catch his attention with a nasty gram or a petty fine or one of her legendary passive-aggressive door hangers. She walked up to a federal agent's personal vehicle in broad daylight, hit it with a golf cart, and walked away like she owned the world. In a way, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Before I go any further, drop a comment right now and tell me, what would you do if you watched your neighbor do this and just casually walked away? No note, no apology, nothing. And tell me where you're watching from. I get messages from people dealing with HOA nightmares from California to Florida to right here in Virginia, and honestly, every single story makes me feel less alone. Stay with me, because this one gets so much better before it's over. Let me take you back about 8 months, because this story doesn't begin with a dented Mercedes and a federal arrest warrant. It begins, like so many HOA horror stories do, with something completely absurd. It begins with a rosebush. Moved into Sycamore Ridge 4 years ago in late September. I was 51 years old, freshly retired from 23 years in the United States Army, 2 combat deployments to the Middle East, a decade in logistics and operations management, and the last 4 years of my career running a multi-site supply chain operation with a staff of 60 people. I had navigated military bureaucracy, international contractors, congressional oversight committees, and the particular special madness of trying to keep equipment operational in desert conditions, where the sand got into everything and the heat turned routine problems into life and death ones. I had sat across tables from colonels who screamed and generals who threatened and government officials in 3 different countries who smiled while trying to manipulate me. I had learned over 2 decades what real power looks like and what the performance of power looks like, and how to tell them apart. Real power is quiet. It doesn't need to announce itself at 10 in the morning on a Saturday while you're unloading a moving truck. I was not, in other words, a man who intimidated easily, but I also wasn't looking for a fight. That part is important, because I think some people hear a story like this and assume the person at the center of it must have been spoiling for confrontation from the start. I wasn't. I was tired, in the good way. Tired of traveling, tired of institutional living, tired of other people's schedules and other people's chains of command. I had done my time. I had served something larger than myself for over 2 decades, and now I wanted something small, something mine. I wanted a house with a yard. I wanted to grow things. I wanted to sit on a porch in the mornings with coffee and hear birds instead of formation calls. I wanted to learn my neighbors' names and mean it when I asked how they were doing. Sycamore Ridge looked like that place. The houses were well-kept colonials, mostly brick with mature trees that had been there long enough to know the street better than any of us. Decent lot sizes, real grass, the kind of neighborhood where kids still rode bikes and people actually used their front porches for something other than Amazon package storage. The HOA fees were $180 a month, reasonable for Central Virginia, and the online reviews were mostly 4 and 5 stars. There were a few cryptic 1-star reviews scattered in, things like management is very aggressive about rules and the board needs to be held accountable, and one that just said don't. I skimmed past them. I was too excited about the house. I should have read every single one of those reviews like a classified intelligence briefing, because that is exactly what they were. Margaret Hollis introduced herself 45 seconds after my moving truck pulled into the driveway. I am precise about the 45 seconds because I had not yet stepped fully off the running board when she materialized at the edge of my property line. She moved the way certain people move. Not fast, but purposeful, with the bearing of someone who has never once questioned their right to occupy any given space. She was in her early 60s, trim and maintained, with silver hair cut in that specific style that says, I have authority, rather than, I have taste. She was wearing, and I want you to appreciate this fully, the HOA polo shirt, on a Saturday, at 10 in the morning, while I was unloading boxes. The little embroidered crest on the chest pocket glinted in the September sun like a badge at a traffic stop. She shook my hand with a grip designed to establish the order of things right out of the gate, smiled with her mouth while her eyes conducted a rapid inventory of my moving truck's contents. I caught her clocking the military gear, the tool chests, the boxes labeled with base housing numbers, and welcomed me to Sycamore Ridge with the warmth of a DMV employee on a Friday afternoon. Then, before I had said more than, thank you, she told me the garbage bins had to be returned to the side yard enclosure by 7 p.m. on collection days, not 7:30, not end of business, not whenever you get a chance. 7 p.m. Collection is at 6, she added pleasantly. So there's really no reason it should take more than an hour. I looked at her for a moment. I matched her smile with one of equal pleasantness and absolutely zero warmth and told her I understood completely. She held the smile for exactly one more beat, sizing something up, and then she turned and walked back down the street toward her house, which was 3 doors down and directly in the sightline of mine. I watched her go. I should have recognized that smile for exactly what it was. Not a welcome, a categorization. Margaret Hollis had spent 6 years developing a taxonomy of her neighbors, and you entered it on day one whether you knew it or not. You were an asset, compliant, useful, rewarding to manage. You were a neutral, invisible, no trouble, easily ignored, or you were a problem. Independent, questioning, capable of making her management more complicated. Something about me, the military stickers on the truck bumper maybe, or the way I held eye contact 2 beats past where most people look away, had placed me in column 3 before my furniture was inside. That was fine. I had dealt with column 3 my entire adult life. What I hadn't dealt with, in all my years of navigating difficult people and complicated institutions, was someone who had turned petty power into a criminal enterprise so comfortable, so long-running, and so normalized that she had stopped even being careful about it. That part was new. 11 months into my residency, I planted a climbing rose along my back fence. Rosa Don Juan, deep red blooms, vigorous growth, the kind of plant that turns a wooden fence into something worth looking at. I researched it, selected the right soil, positioned it for optimal sun exposure, and felt genuinely pleased with myself the first morning it started climbing. 3 weeks later, I received a violation notice in my mailbox. Unapproved plant species within 3 feet of a shared fence line. Fine. $200. Cure period. 14 days. I pulled out my copy of the HOA covenant, all 87 pages of it, which I had actually read cover to cover because 23 years of military service teaches you to read the document before you sign anything, and I found the plant species clause. It referenced an approved plant list dated 2009. I then found the 2014 amendment, which explicitly added climbing roses to the approved list following a resident petition. The amendment had been passed by a board vote of 4-1 and was notarized and filed with the county. I brought all of this to the next HOA meeting. I was calm. I was organized. I had printed copies for every board member. I presented the amendment documentation, cited the specific clause, and politely explained that the fine was being levied in error. Margaret Hollis looked at my documentation for approximately 3 seconds. Then she looked up at me with that smile and said the 2014 amendment had never been properly ratified under the current interpretation of the covenant's amendment procedures. I asked her what the proper ratification process was. She said the board would need to review it. I asked when. She said they'd get to it. The board voted 4-1 to uphold the fine. The one dissenting vote came from a woman named Diane Torres, the board's treasurer, a quiet, sharp woman in her mid-40s who wore reading glasses on a chain and appeared to be the only person on that board who had actually passed a basic ethics course. She voted against, caught my eye across the folding table, and gave the smallest, most imperceptible shake of her head. I nodded back. I paid the fine under protest, submitted a written appeal to the state HOA regulatory office, and hired an attorney who specialized in HOA disputes. Her name was Patricia Osei, and when I described the situation to her over the phone, she was quiet for a moment and then said, "Sycamore Ridge, Margaret Hollis. Yes, I've heard this one before. That should tell you everything you need to know about how long this had been going on." Here is what the next 3 months looked like. Week 1, after the rosebush dispute, I received a notice that my porch light fixture emitted a warm white color temperature outside the approved 3000K, 4000K range. Fine, $75. I measured my bulb with a color meter I borrowed from a hardware store. It registered 3200K, perfectly within the approved 3000K, 4000K range the covenant specified. I sent them the measurement result and the manufacturer's spec sheet. The fine stood. Week 3. My mailbox numbers were found to be positioned 1/8 of an inch below the HOA mandated height. Fine, $150. I measured my mailbox numbers with a steel rule. They were at the mandated height. I sent photographic evidence with a measuring tape clearly in frame, shot from 2 angles at different times of day, so lighting could not be blamed. The fine stood. Let me pause there for a moment because I want you to really appreciate the 1/8 of an inch detail. That is 3 millimeters. The width of 2 pennies stacked together. That is what Margaret Hollis considered a violation worthy of a $150 fine. And when I proved, with photographic evidence, that the measurement was wrong, the fine still stood. Because the point was never the measurement. The point was the fine. Week 5. A guest's vehicle was parked 6 inches over the edge of my designated visitor space. Fine, $100. The guest was my cousin Danny, who had visited for 3 hours on a Sunday afternoon to help me install a ceiling fan. He had parked exactly where I directed him. The 6 inches in question placed the rear corner of his bumper marginally over a painted line in my private driveway. Not in a fire lane, not blocking anyone, not in a shared space. 6 inches over a line that existed entirely on my own property. The fine stood. Week 7. I received a notice that my front door color was outside the approved autumn palette for homes on my block. Fine, $125. I looked at the approved palette document, which was printed in a resolution so low, the color swatches looked like they were from a 1992 brochure scanned on someone's grandmother's printer. My door was a color called tricorn black, a deeply classic neutral near black that appeared on literally every timeless door color list ever published by every paint brand in America. I looked at my neighbor's front doors. The house to my left had a door that was a faded medium green, paint peeling at the hinge side. The house 2 doors down had a door I would describe as motel pool blue. Neither had ever received a notice. I knew this because I asked. The fine stood. I started a spreadsheet. I want to be honest with you about why I built it. It wasn't because I thought it would lead to a federal investigation. It wasn't strategy, not at that point. It was something much simpler and much more stubborn. I had spent 23 years in an institution that valued documentation above almost everything else, where the difference between "this happened" and "I can prove this happened" was the difference between justice and nothing. And I was not going to be in a situation where I knew something wrong was being done to me and I had nothing to show for it. Date, violation type, fine amount, documentation. I submitted, board vote outcome, notes. By month 4, I had 11 entries and $1,240 in fines, all of them either fabricated, misapplied, or overruled by documentation that Margaret's board reviewed and dismissed in the same breath. My neighbors watched this whole thing with the particular quiet sympathy of people who recognize a recurring pattern and are temporarily relieved it's pointed somewhere else. I noticed the way conversations about Margaret happened. Voice drops, quick looks up and down the street, the careful neutrality that people adopt when they've been burned for speaking plainly. Fear does that. Sustained, normalized, low-grade fear does that to a neighborhood, the same way it does to any organization where one person has held unchecked authority too long. Gerald was the first one to tell me his story. Retired history teacher, 68 years old, lived directly across the street from me. He had a modest, well-kept house and a vegetable garden in the back that produced more tomatoes than any one person could reasonably consume, which was why he was always giving them away to neighbors, which, as you'll see, became relevant. He told me, in a low voice during one of our early morning driveway conversations, that he had been fined $400 in a single month 2 years ago for what he still couldn't fully explain. She picks someone every year, he said. Usually whoever pushed back most recently. You pushed back about the plant list. Has anyone ever pushed back hard enough to actually stop it? I asked. He thought about it with the deliberate patience of a man who has been a teacher and knows how to give a question its full weight. Not yet, he said. A woman named Karen Chen, and yes, I am aware of the irony embedded in that name in this particular story, and no, I cannot do anything about it, lived 4 houses down and had 2 kids in middle school. She was an accountant by profession, sharp and organized, the kind of person who notices when numbers don't add up. She had noticed, about 2 years before I moved in, that the reserve fund balance presented at HOA meetings seemed inconsistent with the amounts being collected in monthly assessments. She had raised this question once, calmly and respectfully, citing her right as a dues-paying member to see accurate financial reporting. The fine campaign against her had started within 72 hours. 6 weeks and $1,800 later, Karen Chen had publicly retracted her question at an HOA meeting, stated for the record that she was satisfied with the board's financial management, and never attended another meeting. She told me this in her driveway one evening, her voice flat and controlled, her eyes checking the street with the regularity of someone who has been conditioned to check. I have 2 kids in this school district, she said. I couldn't afford to have my house become a target every month. I told her I understood, and I told her something that seemed to confuse her a little. I told her to keep a record going forward. Anything that happened, dates, amounts, what was said, who was there, write it down. Why? She asked. Because truth needs witnesses, I said, and witnesses need notes. She looked at me for a moment, the way people look at someone who has just said something that sounds like it should be common sense, but that they have somehow never heard articulated before. Then she nodded slowly and went inside. I went home and opened my spreadsheet and added a tab labeled Neighbors. Karen's account went in first, then Gerald's, then the couple on the corner who'd been through the renovation campaign. By the end of that week, I had documented 8 separate accounts of targeted fine campaigns against individual residents, 4 accounts of meeting manipulation, and 2 accounts of what I can only call neighbor against neighbor social engineering. Cases where Margaret had apparently suggested to one resident that a specific neighbor was creating problems for the community, deliberately seeding division to prevent the kind of collective comparison that might allow people to see the full picture. She had thought of everything. She had thought of everything except me, and she had definitely not thought of Marcus. Here is what I didn't fully understand yet, and what would only become clear later. The fines were not the core of Margaret's operation. They were a side effect of it, the exhaust fumes from an engine running something much larger and much more profitable underneath. But I'm getting ahead of myself. What I understood at the time was that Margaret had built a machine. The 4 board members who voted however she told them to vote were not simply compliant. They were compromised. I learned later that one of them, a man named Howard Price who had lived in the neighborhood for 12 years, had been having his HOA dues paid anonymously for 3 years. Another, a woman named Sandra Kelch, had received a variance approval for an addition to her home that had been denied twice before Margaret's tenure. These were not coincidences. These were investments. Margaret also had a network of what I can only describe as neighborhood informants, residents who reported violations to her directly in exchange for what I can only assume was a kind of protected status. Minor compliance issues overlooked. Variance requests approved without drama. The social currency of not being on Margaret's list. It was, in structure and function, a protection racket on a cul-de-sac in Central Virginia. And when I started attending every single HOA meeting, started recording them on my phone, started submitting written dissents to every fine and every vote, and started CCing the state HOA regulatory board on every correspondence, Margaret escalated. She started coming after my guests. Gerald, my neighbor across the street, stopped by one Tuesday afternoon to drop off a bag of tomatoes from his garden. He parked in front of my house for approximately 25 minutes. Margaret photographed his vehicle from her driveway, identified him as a guest associated with my property, and issued a visitor parking notice. His vehicle had been parked legally in a public street space. The citation was for extended visitor presence creating neighborhood congestion. I am not kidding. Extended visitor presence creating neighborhood congestion. On a street with 2 cars on it, I appealed. The board voted to uphold it, 4-1. I installed cameras, 4 of them, front driveway, backyard, left side of house, right side of house, high definition, night vision capable, with cloud backup to an off-site server so that no one could physically tamper with the storage and eliminate footage. I put up the housings on a Saturday afternoon while Margaret watched from her porch 3 houses down, her coffee cup held in both hands, her face doing something I could only describe as recalibrating. She showed up at my door 48 hours later to inform me that externally mounted surveillance equipment visible from community common spaces required prior HOA approval and architectural review. I asked her to cite the specific covenant clause. She said the board would be voting on the policy at the next meeting. I said I'd see her there. The vote passed 4-1. I looked at Diane Torres after the vote. She mouthed something that looked like, "I'm sorry." I shook my head slightly. I was past sorry. I was in documentation mode. It was a Thursday evening in late October when Marcus Webb pulled into my driveway in that black Mercedes. We'd served together during my second deployment. He'd been attached to our unit in an advisory capacity for about 4 months, and we'd maintained the kind of friendship that military service produces. Not constant, not loud, but deep and durable. The kind where 2 years can pass and you pick up in the same place without effort. We grabbed lunch or dinner when he passed through, exchanged texts about football, called each other when things went sideways in our respective lives. He'd told me he was coming through the area on a work assignment. Federal consulting, he said, deliberately vague the way he always was about what he actually did, which I had long since stopped pressing him on. He asked if he could crash for a few days. I told him my couch was his. He arrived around 7 p.m., and if you had looked at him, jeans, a gray Henley, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, you would have seen a tall, fit, easygoing man in his mid-50s who looked like he might teach history at a good university. He had the kind of calm that comes from having been in genuinely dangerous situations and finding over time that most situations are not that dangerous. We sat on my back porch until almost midnight. Good bourbon, old stories, that comfortable back and forth that only exists between people who knew each other before they were entirely finished becoming who they are. I told him about Margaret. All of it. The rosebush, the fine spreadsheet, the 4-1 votes, Gerald's tomatoes, the camera ordinance she'd invented in real time. Marcus listened with his characteristic stillness, occasionally asking precise, clarifying questions. "What's the reserve fund situation?" he asked at one point. I looked at him. "Why would you ask that?" "Because everything else you're describing is harassment and power games," he said. "But harassment and power games usually have a financial substrate. Where's the money?" I thought about something Diane Torres had said to me after a board meeting 3 weeks earlier in the parking lot, quietly, while checking over her shoulder, that the reserve fund balance seemed lower than it should be given the assessments collected over the past 4 years, and that the financial reports Margaret presented at meetings were, in her word, opaque. I told Marcus this. He nodded slowly and looked out at the dark yard. "What contractor handles the community maintenance work?" "Guy named Reyes," I said. "Eddie Reyes. His truck is in Margaret's driveway at least once a month." Marcus took a long sip of bourbon and said nothing for a moment. Then, "Keep your cameras clean and your spreadsheet current." I didn't ask him what he meant. Not yet. But something in the way he said it, not as a suggestion, but as a professional instruction from a man who chose his words precisely, stayed with me as we went inside for the night. I lay awake for a while, listening to the neighborhood settle into its nighttime sounds, thinking about the pattern Marcus had identified without naming. Harassment and power games usually have a financial substrate. I turned that sentence over in my mind until it became something I could see clearly. Margaret's entire system, the fines, the 4-1 board, the informant network, the monthly violation notices, the campaigns against anyone who asked the wrong question, all of it created an environment where residents were too fearful, too financially pressured, and too divided to look at the numbers with clear eyes. She had built a distraction machine, and whatever the distraction was covering for had been running underneath it for 6 years. I finally fell asleep around 2 in the morning. Marcus, I later learned, was on the phone with his field office until 3. Friday morning arrived cold and clear, the kind of October morning in Virginia that looks like a painting of itself. The trees along Sycamore Ridge were in full color, amber and rust, and a deep red that reminded me, not for the first time, of my climbing rose. There was a thin frost on the grass that wouldn't survive past 8 a.m. Marcus was up before me. When I came downstairs at 7:30, he was already outside, standing at the edge of the driveway with a coffee, doing what I now recognized as his default outdoor activity, studying the geography of a space, the sightlines, the traffic patterns, the ways people moved through it, and what that revealed about how they thought of it as theirs. I was inside pouring my own coffee, watching him through the kitchen window when I heard it. That crunch, the specific, unmistakable percussion of metal impacting metal, not sharp like a gunshot, but deep and dull, the way something sounds when it's absorbing force rather than deflecting it. I was through the front door before I'd fully processed what I was doing, coffee still in hand, and I came outside to find Marcus standing beside his Mercedes with an expression I can only describe as forensically calm. He was looking at the passenger door. The dent was immediately, clearly visible. A 4-inch impact crater punched into the door panel, with a horizontal paint transfer streak running from the impact point toward the wheel well. The paint was white. The golf cart's bumper was white. You didn't need to be a federal agent to connect those two data points. Margaret was approximately 20 feet away, walking in the direction of her house. She had not stopped. She had not turned around. She was smoothing the front of her polo shirt with both hands in the gesture I now recognized as her default response to having done something she was pretending hadn't happened. "Hey!" I called out. "Margaret!" She stopped, took a breath, turned halfway, presenting her profile rather than facing me directly. The body language of someone managing a situation rather than engaging with it. "The cart slipped," she said. Her voice was controlled, almost bored. "These things happen. You were walking away," I said. "You didn't leave a note." "I was going to come by later." I looked at her. 20 feet of morning air and 6 months of documented harassment between us, and she was standing there telling me she was going to come by later. For a dent she had watched herself make on someone else's car that she was walking away from. "You were walking back to your house," I said again, very calmly. "I told you." She stopped, reset, and when she turned fully to face me, the authority had reassembled itself into place like armor snapping back on. "These things happen in a community environment. The HOA has an incident process. Submit a report through the proper channel." "An incident report," I repeated. "That is the proper channel," she said. Clipped. Final. The tone of a woman who has ended hundreds of conversations this way and watched them stay ended. She turned and walked back to her house. Front door closed. Done. I turned to Marcus. He was crouched down beside the door, examining the scrape with the unhurried attention of a man who does not need to perform urgency because his urgency is always internal. He stood back up, looked at the closed front door 3 houses down, and then looked at me. "You got it on camera?" he asked. "3 angles," I said. "Full HD. Cloud backup." Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile exactly, but the settling of a decision that had already been forming. He nodded once, the specific nod of a man who has just confirmed something. "Don't say anything else to her today," he said. "Don't file the HOA's incident report. Come inside and show me the footage." We sat at my kitchen table with my laptop between us and watched the footage 3 times. First straight through, then again in slow motion at the moment of impact. Then again from the angle that showed Margaret's face most clearly. The quarter second of her head turning to look at the damage. The 2-second scan in both directions, and then the walk. 42 seconds from impact to front door closing. Marcus watched it with his arms folded and his face completely neutral. Then he reached into the interior pocket of his jacket and placed something on the table between us, a credential wallet. Dark blue, slim, gold lettering that had been read by a lot of people in a lot of rooms. Special Agent Marcus Webb, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Public Corruption Unit. I looked at it for a long moment. Then I looked at Marcus, who looked back at me with the patient steadiness of a man who has placed this wallet on a lot of tables and knows how much space the revelation needs. "How long?" I said. 22 years, he said. Marcus laid it out methodically, the way he did everything, starting with the broadest frame and working inward, each layer adding specificity and weight. For the past 3 years, his task force had been investigating a pattern of financial misconduct across HOA-governed communities in 9C, the county. Not random violations, a pattern, the same signatures appearing in different neighborhoods, reserve fund balances that declined without corresponding capital expenditures, maintenance contractor invoices that arrived as lump sums without itemized breakdowns, assessment increases that exceeded documented maintenance costs by margins that didn't make actuarial sense. 4 subdivisions: Sycamore Ridge, Briarwood Commons, Lakeview Estates, and Cedarwood. Different boards, different management styles. But Eddie Reyes's contracting company, Reyes Premier Property Solutions, appeared in the financial records of 3 of them. "Sycamore Ridge has been on our peripheral radar for about 4 months, Marcus said. Margaret Hollis's name appeared in connection with an unrelated county contract issue, nothing actionable on its own. But the reserve fund data here matched the pattern from the other 3 communities, and the Reyes connection was significant enough to warrant closer attention." He looked at my laptop, at the spreadsheet still visible on the screen. What I needed was documented local behavior, evidence of the control mechanism she uses to keep residents from asking the right questions, the fine campaigns, the board manipulation, the social pressure. Without that, the financial case is harder to contextualize for a jury. He paused. "You've been building that documentation for 6 months without knowing what it was." I sat back in my chair. I want to describe what that moment felt like, because I think it's important. 6 months of what I had treated as a personal battle, as one woman's obsessive targeting of a resident who'd pushed back about a rose bush, was rearranging itself in my mind into something with a completely different architecture. The fine machine wasn't just harassment. The 4-to-1 board votes weren't just Margaret's ego. The campaigns against Karen Chen for asking about the reserve fund, the social engineering designed to keep neighbors from comparing notes, the whole elaborate structure of control and fear that Margaret had built over 6 years. None of it was about power for power's sake. It was infrastructure. It was the apparatus she used to keep people too afraid, too distracted, and too divided to look at the numbers clearly. And underneath the numbers, there was $300,000 missing. How much exactly? I asked. Preliminary forensic estimate puts it somewhere between $250,000 and $350,000 over approximately 4 years, Marcus said. The Reyes invoices alone account for approximately $210,000 in payments that don't correspond to documented work. There's also a secondary account we've identified that appears to receive transfers from the reserve fund through a shell LLC structure. I thought about Karen Chen, standing in her driveway, telling me in a flat voice that she had retracted her financial question at an HOA meeting because she couldn't afford for her house to become a target. I thought about Gerald saying, "Not yet," with the resignation of a man who has made peace with a situation he doesn't have the tools to change. I thought about the couple on the corner who had spent $2,800 in fines during a renovation and quietly given up attending meetings. She built all of this, I said slowly, to keep people from finding the money. That's how it usually works, Marcus said. The financial fraud is the motive. The harassment is the moat. He told me what he needed. He needed Diane Torres. He needed the board meeting records I documented. He needed the camera footage, going back as far as I had it. And he needed the morning's footage of Margaret Hollis walking away from a federal agent's dented car without leaving a note. Because in a federal obstruction and fraud case, the footage of a guilty person's casual contempt for consequence was more useful than most people understood. She just gave us the most recent and most visible example, Marcus said, of a woman who has been operating without consequences for so long that she's forgotten they exist. He was right about that. He was exactly right about that. And consequences, as it turned out, had been sitting in my guest room drinking bourbon. We spent the rest of that Friday morning and most of the afternoon at my kitchen table. I gave Marcus access to my entire documentation archive. The spreadsheet, the correspondence records, the photographs, the footage from my cameras going back 3 months, the notes I'd made after every HOA meeting. He reviewed all of it with the focused efficiency of a man who reads evidence for a living, occasionally pausing to ask a clarifying question or make a note in a small black notebook he produced from his jacket pocket. Diane Torres agreed to meet with us that Sunday. She came to my house through the back gate, arriving the way people arrive when they've been afraid of being seen doing normal things for too long. She sat down at my kitchen table, looked at Marcus's credentials for a long moment, and then looked up with the expression of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has just been offered permission to set it down. "I've known something was wrong with the financials for almost 2 years," she said. Her voice was steady, but there were lines around her eyes that spoke to sleepless nights and swallowed concerns. The reserve fund balance dropped significantly between 2021 and 2023, even though assessments went up. The maintenance invoices from Reyes's company are always lump sum, no itemized breakdown. When I've asked for backup documentation, Margaret tells me the records are with the management company and she'll get them to me, but they never come. "Has she ever threatened you?" Marcus asked. Diane was quiet for a moment. Not explicitly, but she told me after I voted against the camera policy that she hoped I wasn't becoming a problem and that board positions in this community are voluntary and revocable. She paused. I understood what she meant. Marcus nodded slowly. "Would you be willing to cooperate with our investigation?" She looked at him, then at me, then back at him. "What does that mean, practically?" "It means we give you a recording device," Marcus said. "You attend board meetings as you normally would. You ask questions about the financials as you normally would. You report to me any conversations in which Margaret discusses fund allocation or contractor arrangements. We don't ask you to do anything outside your normal role. We just ask you to document what you already see and hear." Diane Torres looked down at her hands for a moment. "Will she go to prison?" "If the evidence supports the charges," Marcus said. "Yes." Diane reached across the table and picked up a pen. "Tell me what I need to do." Meanwhile, Margaret was becoming unraveled in her own particular way. When she learned through her network that Marcus was pursuing a property damage claim, not through the HOA's internal process, which she controlled, but through his insurance company with documented photographic and video evidence, she did what cornered, controlling people always do. She overcorrected. She called an emergency board meeting 4 days after the incident, at which she introduced a resolution declaring that my camera system had violated community surveillance guidelines and that any footage captured by a non-approved system was inadmissible in civil proceedings involving community members. The legal absurdity of a homeowners association passing a resolution about evidence admissibility apparently did not occur to her, or if it did, she didn't care. The board voted, 4-1, to approve the resolution. Then Howard Price submitted a written statement to the HOA's legal correspondence file stating that he had witnessed me deliberately obstruct Margaret's golf cart's path on the morning of the incident, causing the collision. A fabricated witness statement about an incident captured on 3 camera angles. Then Margaret approached Diane Torres outside a grocery store 2 weeks after the emergency meeting. She asked Diane to reconsider her position on the camera resolution. She mentioned that there was budget flexibility in the HOA's Community Improvement Fund that could benefit Diane's block. She was careful. She didn't use explicit language, but she was not careful enough. Diane was wearing a recording device. Over the next 6 weeks, Diane Torres attended 4 board meetings and 2 private conversations with Margaret, recording all of them. Marcus met with her after each one, reviewing the recordings, building the evidentiary record. What those recordings contained was extraordinary in its candor and its carelessness. The carelessness of a person who had operated without consequence for so long that she had forgotten consequences were theoretically possible. In the first board meeting, Margaret discussed the upcoming contract renewal with Reyes's company, Reyes Premier Property Solutions, and referred explicitly to our arrangement regarding payment structure. She specified a percentage. She directed Howard Price to approve the invoice for $47,000 for drainage infrastructure maintenance and instructed Sandra Kelch to confirm receipt of the work order in the meeting minutes, despite neither of them having any documentation that the work had been performed. In the second recording, a private conversation in the HOA management office, Margaret told Diane that the reserve fund had some flexibility built in that allowed for certain administrative expenses that didn't need to be itemized in the public-facing financial reports. She mentioned Reyes's name twice. She mentioned a bank account, not the HOA's primary operating account, but a secondary account that handled contractor coordination. In the fourth board meeting, when Diane gently raised a question about the reserve fund balance, Margaret turned to her with a stillness that the recording captured perfectly and said, "Diane, I would really encourage you to think carefully about what questions are worth your time and what questions are going to make your life in this community very uncomfortable. Extortion, fraud, bribery, wire fraud, conspiracy." Marcus sent the recording files to his field office. His supervisor, after reviewing the first 2 recordings, authorized full task force activation. They began pulling financial records, HOA bank statements, Reyes's company filings, the management company's documentation. They subpoenaed 4 years of reserve fund transactions. The secondary account that Margaret had mentioned contained $286,000 in funds traceable to HOA reserve deposits. The final indictment count came to 9 charges. I knew it was coming. Marcus had told me the evening before, not the exact time, but the day. "Be home tomorrow morning," he said. Then he packed his bag, put it in the trunk of the Mercedes, and drove away to wherever federal agents go the night before an arrest. I stood in my driveway and watched the taillights disappear around the corner and felt something I didn't entirely expect to feel. Not triumph, not relief, but something quieter and heavier. The weight of 6 years of someone else's cruelty about to find its reckoning. I didn't sleep well. I woke up at 5:30, made coffee, sat at my kitchen table with my laptop, and opened the spreadsheet one last time. 67 entries across multiple tabs, $1,340 in my own fines, 8 neighbor accounts, dozens of documented board votes, 3 months of camera footage, 6 weeks of Diane's recordings, the secondary account with $286,000 traceable to the reserve fund, the Shell LLC, the Reyes invoices for work that had never been done on streets we walked every day. I looked at it for a while. Then I closed the laptop. Some things don't need to be looked at anymore. I was standing in my kitchen at 8:47 a.m. when I heard the cars. 4 of them. The sound of government vehicles has a specific quality. There's a uniformity to the engine sounds, a synchronized arrival that speaks to coordination and planning. 2 unmarked sedans with federal plates came first, followed by a marked county sheriff's cruiser, and then a 4th vehicle I recognized as belonging to the state attorney's office by the decal on the rear window. They parked along the street in front of Margaret's house with the careful spacing of people who have done this before and know exactly where to position themselves. I walked to my front window. The neighborhood was already watching. Gerald was on his porch with both hands wrapped around his coffee mug, perfectly still. The couple 2 doors down, the ones who'd been through the renovation campaign, were standing at their living room window together. Karen Chen was at the edge of her driveway, her daughter visible inside through the front door screen, watching over her mother's shoulder. Diane Torres was at the end of her own driveway with her arms crossed and her reading glasses pushed up on her head, watching with an expression I recognized immediately. The particular hard-won calm of someone who has been afraid for a long time and is watching the thing they were afraid of get smaller. Marcus walked up Margaret's front path in a dark suit with his badge clipped to his belt, accompanied by 2 agents I hadn't met, both of them carrying the same contained professional energy he did, and a uniformed sheriff's deputy. He moved without hurry. The knock he gave Margaret's door was the knock of a man who is completely certain it will be answered. It was. Margaret opened the door in her bathrobe, blonde gray hair not yet arranged for the day, reading glasses in her hand. Whatever she had been doing at 8:47 on a Tuesday morning in November, I'll never know, and I don't particularly need to. She was not prepared for what was standing on her front porch. She saw the agents. She saw the deputy. And then she saw Marcus. This is the part I will carry with me for the rest of my life. Standing 30 yards away, watching through my front window, I saw the exact moment when Margaret Hollis understood. Not what was happening. I think some part of her brain understood the mechanics of it immediately, the way trained pattern recognizers always understand the pattern even when they wish they didn't. What I watched her understand was the full architecture of her mistake. She looked at Marcus, the man she had hit with a golf cart and walked away from, the guest she had dismissed as a temporary inconvenience with a nice car, the person she had filed under, not a factor, and moved on from. And she saw him for what he actually was. And 6 years of carefully maintained control dissolved in about 4 seconds. Her mouth opened. Nothing came out. Margaret Hollis. Marcus's voice carried clearly in the cold November air, reaching me 30 yards away without effort. The voice of a man who has delivered this speech many times and has never once softened it unnecessarily. I have a warrant for your arrest on charges of wire fraud, embezzlement of community funds, conspiracy, and bribery. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed for you. She started to say something. One of the agents with Marcus took a half step forward, and whatever she had been about to say became nothing. He continued reading the Miranda rights. The deputy moved to her side. I didn't hear the rest of it, not because I couldn't, but because the street had gone into a silence that was thicker than sound. The particular silence of 40-some households, breathing together at the same moment, watching something they'd been waiting for without quite knowing they'd been waiting for it. 6 years of a neighborhood holding its breath and looking at the floor every time Margaret drove past in her golf cart. 6 years of lowered voices and retracted questions and $100 fines for 6-inch parking errors. All of it walking out a front door in handcuffs on a cold Tuesday morning. The federal indictment came down 6 weeks after the arrest. 9 counts, 3 counts of wire fraud across different financial instruments and time periods, 1 count of embezzlement of community funds, 1 count of conspiracy to commit fraud, 2 counts of bribery, 1 count of witness tampering related to Howard Price's fabricated accident statement, and 1 count of obstruction of justice. The indictment was 63 pages long. I read all of it. Eddie Reyes was indicted separately on 4 counts. Wire fraud, conspiracy, 2 counts of filing fraudulent business records. His company's financial records, when fully audited, revealed a billing structure so systematically fraudulent that the forensic accountants described it in their report as a pre-designed extraction mechanism rather than a legitimate contracting arrangement. Of the $312,000 paid to Reyes Premier Property Solutions from the HOA's accounts over 4 years, approximately $210,000 represented fraudulent billings for work either never performed by different subcontractors at a fraction of the billed cost, or grossly and deliberately overbilled. Reyes agreed to cooperate with the prosecution in exchange for a reduced charge. He provided detailed testimony about the arrangement structure, the payment routing through the Shell LLC, and the specific conversations with Margaret in which the kickback percentages had been negotiated. His testimony was, by all accounts, comprehensive. He did not protect her. He had apparently decided, when the federal indictment landed in his inbox, that self-preservation was worth more than loyalty to someone who had always treated him as a means to an end anyway. Howard Price and Sandra Kelch both accepted plea agreements before trial. Price received 18 months of supervised probation and a $15,000 fine. Kelch received 6 months of probation, community service, and a letter of censure that will follow her professional record permanently. The fourth compliant board member, a man named Dennis Farrow, who had been the quietest and most invisible of Margaret's voting bloc, resigned within 48 hours of the arrest, submitted a written statement to investigators detailing everything he'd witnessed over 4 years of board membership, and has, as far as I know, not attended a community event since. Margaret Hollis's defense attorney filed 4 pre-trial motions, the most notable of which argued entrapment, the claim that FBI involvement had induced her to commit acts she would not otherwise have committed. The motion was denied at the pre-trial hearing. The judge's written ruling noted that the fraudulent financial arrangements predated federal involvement by a minimum of 4 years, that the recorded conversations in which Margaret discussed the kickback structure occurred in the normal course of her management activities rather than in response to any inducement, and that the entrapment argument was, in the judge's precise words, not supported by the factual record. The trial lasted 12 days. 43 witnesses were called. The recordings Diane Torres had made were played for the jury in their entirety. I was told by Marcus afterward that the jury had listened to the 4th board meeting recording, the one where Margaret told Diane that asking questions about the reserve fund would make her life in this community very uncomfortable, with a specific, visible stillness that experienced trial attorneys learn to read as the moment when a verdict has been decided. Margaret was convicted on 7 of the 9 counts. The 2 acquittals were on procedural grounds related to the specific timing of certain financial transfers, not on the substantive charges. She was sentenced to 4 years and 3 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. She was ordered to pay $312,000 in restitution to the Sycamore Ridge Homeowners Association and its members, plus $47,000 in civil penalties, plus court costs. The secondary bank account was seized by federal order. The Shell LLC was dissolved. The funds, $286,000, were returned to the HOA's operating account under court supervision. The HOA's full financial records, going back to the beginning of Margaret's tenure, were audited by an independent forensic accounting firm. Every fine levied during those 6 years was reviewed against the written documentation. Approximately $67,000 in fines were determined to have been improperly levied, misapplied, or levied without evidentiary basis. Refunds were issued to every affected resident. My $1,340 came back in the mail with a letter from the new interim board president. The letter was 2 paragraphs. The second paragraph said simply, "We are sorry, this should not have happened." I sat with that letter for a while. Then I added it to the spreadsheet, filed under Resolved. Marcus sent me a photograph 3 months after the trial. His Mercedes, freshly repaired, paint perfect, parked in what looked like an FBI field office parking lot. The text message beneath the photo read, "Worth every dent." I printed it and framed it. It hangs in my kitchen, next to the window that looks out over the backyard and the climbing rose. I want to tell you what Sycamore Ridge looks like now, because I think it's the part of this story that matters most, even more than the arrest and the trial and the 7 convictions. It looks different. Not physically. The brick houses and the copper mailbox numbers and the mature trees are all exactly as they were. But the atmosphere of a neighborhood is not its architecture. It's what people do when they see each other. Whether they stop, whether they wave, whether they lower their voices or raise them, people stop now. Gerald brought tomatoes to 3 different neighbors last summer, in broad daylight, parking wherever he wanted, staying as long as he liked. The couple down the street planted a flower garden along their front walk that would have drawn 4 violations under the old regime. A family near the entrance put up a basketball hoop and it stayed up. Diane Torres became interim HOA president. In December, elected unanimously by the residents at a special meeting. The first thing she did was post the complete financial records, every transaction, every invoice, every balance, on the community website. She created an open-door policy for financial questions. She hired an independent auditor for the annual review. She reduced the fine schedule by 60% and eliminated the visitor parking categories entirely. She also proposed naming the community garden after Gerald. I seconded the motion. It passed unanimously. I still have my cameras. Not because I'm afraid, but because they're good cameras, and I paid a lot for them, and they give me genuinely excellent footage of the deer that come through the yard at night. Marcus tells me the footage is admissible in any jurisdiction. I keep meaning to use that as a caption somewhere. Here's what I think about when I think about this whole experience, and I do think about it more than you might expect from someone who won. I think about how long it went on before me. 6 years, 47 families, People who were fined for rose bushes and mailbox numbers and tomato deliveries and whatever else Margaret decided required enforcement on whatever particular morning she woke up feeling like reminding everyone who held the power. People who paid because challenging it wasn't worth the cost. People who stopped coming to meetings. People who swallowed their frustration year after year because they had mortgages and children and professional reputations and all the thousand things that make a person reluctant to become the neighborhood's designated problem. I think about how much she collected, not just the fraudulent $312,000 from the reserve fund, though that number is staggering when you sit with it, when you think about what $312,000 represents, the roof replacements that didn't happen, the drainage work that was billed and never performed, the community amenities that 47 families paid for and never received. I think about the other money, the cumulative fines across 6 years of targeted campaigns. The residents who paid rather than fight, not because the fines were right, but because fighting was expensive and exhausting and Margaret controlled the process. I think about Karen Chen's $1,800, Gerald's $400, the renovation couple's $2,800. Multiply that pattern across 6 years and 47 households, and the number is significant in its own right. Money quietly extracted from people who were doing nothing wrong as the price of being allowed to live in their own homes without constant harassment. I think about Diane Torres, voting against the machine, 4-1, every single time, alone at that folding table with her reading glasses on a chain, casting her dissent into the record, while 4 people stared at her and 1 person made mental notes. She could have stopped coming. She could have resigned from the board and reduced her exposure and spent her Tuesday evenings doing literally anything else. She stayed because some things need to be on the record, even when no one with any power is watching. She stayed because she was an accountant who had looked at the numbers and knew what she was looking at, and walking away from knowledge you can't unhave is its own kind of wrong. She stayed because she was, simply and without drama, a person of integrity in a room that had very little of it. Diane Torres is why this story ended the way it did. Not because she single-handedly broke the case. Marcus and his task force built that, but because she held a position in that room for years without surrendering it, and when the moment came when holding that position could actually matter, she was still there. She hadn't been ground down. She hadn't been bought off. She was there, and she was willing, and she was wired. I think about Gerald bringing tomatoes, that particular detail, an old man crossing a street with a bag of garden tomatoes, doing the most neighborly possible thing and receiving a parking violation for it, is the image I return to most often when I try to explain to people who haven't lived it what this kind of HOA abuse actually feels like. It's not dramatic in that moment. It's just mean. It's the weaponization of the mundane, the transformation of ordinary human kindness into a liability. That's what makes it so corrosive. Not the big violations, but the slow accumulation of small ones. The grinding daily message that normalcy is not safe, that keeping your head down is the only rational strategy. Gerald told me, not yet, with the patience of a man who has been a teacher and knows how to wait for the right conditions. What he didn't know was that the right conditions had just moved in across the street and started building a spreadsheet. Here is what I want to say directly to anyone watching this who is in the middle of something like this right now. I didn't beat Margaret Hollis because I was smarter than she was. I didn't beat her because I was better connected or better resourced or more strategic. I beat her because she made a mistake she genuinely could not have anticipated. She chose a target who happened to have a federal agent in the guest room. That's luck. That's circumstance. That's the universe deciding on one October morning that enough was enough. What I contributed was documentation, and that part, only that part, was not luck. 23 years in the United States Army taught me one thing above almost everything else. The most dangerous thing you can do to an abuse of power is create an accurate, time-stamped, verifiable record of it. Date, time, amount, action taken, evidence submitted, outcome, every single entry. Not because you know what it will become, not because you have a plan, but because truth has a way of finding its shape when it's been carefully, stubbornly, persistently recorded, and lies have a way of collapsing when someone finally holds them up to the light long enough. Margaret's entire operation was built on the assumption that no one would look closely enough, for long enough, with enough resources to do anything about what they found. She was right about the management company, which processed her fraudulent invoices without question for 4 years. She was right about most of her neighbors, who had learned through painful experience that looking closely cost money and peace and sometimes more. She was right about 4 of her 5 board members, who had traded their judgment for whatever currency Margaret was paying in. She was wrong about Diane. She was wrong about me. And she was catastrophically, historically, irreversibly wrong about the man whose car she hit with a golf cart on a Friday morning in October. The man whose door she dented, whose paint she scratched, and whose case file she placed herself in the center of while smoothing her HOA polo shirt and walking back to her house without a backward glance. There is a version of this story where Marcus doesn't visit, where the dent gets repaired, Margaret gets away with it, and Sycamore Ridge continues as it was for another year, another 6 years, until the reserve fund runs dry and someone finally does the math. That version exists. It happened in Briarwood Commons and Lakeview Estates before the federal task force reached them. There are Margaret Hollises in neighborhoods all over this country right now, presiding over small fiefdoms, collecting their informal taxes, keeping their neighbors afraid and isolated and too exhausted to compare notes. The difference between that version and this one is a spreadsheet, a set of cameras, a friend who asked the right questions at midnight over good bourbon, and a retired teacher who came over with tomatoes and ended up becoming evidence. Some mistakes are small. Some mistakes are $312,000 and 4 years in a federal facility and your name in a court document that will outlast everything you built. My rosebush is climbing higher every year. The blooms this past summer were the best it's had since I planted it. Deep red, exactly what I wanted, right where I wanted it. No variance requests, no violation notices, not a single fine, just a rose on a fence growing the way it was. Always supposed to. And every time I look at it, I think about how good it feels to have written everything down. If this story meant something to you, if you're in an HOA that feels more like a fiefdom than a community, share this video. Leave a comment. Tell me your story. The most important thing Margaret Hollis didn't understand is that these things only survive in silence. So let's keep the lights on. Subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.